Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today, despite the fact that, Robby, you are not in the studio with me. What is going on, my friend?
I'm just treating every day like it's Memorial Day in the immediate future. No, I'm not feeling well today, and rather than come in and have you wear a mask and deprive our viewers of your lovely face, I decided to just stay at home for the day. So.
Well, I appreciate your grace there, Robby. Much appreciated. Well, today we are going to discuss some developments on the lab leak origin theory, gun control reform, and hear what's going on with student debt cancellation. But first, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau is making headlines for legislation that would put a national freeze on handgun purchases in Canada if it passes the Canadian Parliament later this year, meaning it would no longer be possible to buy, sell, or transfer handguns anywhere in Canada. Some American legislators criticized the move, with Congressman Thomas Massey saying, quote, "The dystopian future Trudeau is manifesting in Canada is coming to America as U.S. citizens don't get involved, if U.S. citizens don't get involved." Robby, is this a dystopian future? Does what happens in Canada ultimately accrue in the United States as well?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's obviously a lot of kind of fear-mongering about the situation here. I mean, the reality is that the American people tend to be very suspicious of new gun control measures, and so I don't imagine we're going to do what Canada is doing. But I mean, and what Canada is doing, I don't think is particularly correct or good policy either. I mean, we have, making it harder for people to buy and sell guns. I mean, fine, do that, but you're not going to decrease in America, not in Canada, but in America, we have so many guns, illegal guns, out on the streets that people have that they're already not allowed to own. So if you really want to do something, you could just enforce those laws more militantly. But what many progressives have decided is that enforcing those kinds of laws is more likely to create, uncomfortable police encounters or lend itself toward mass incarceration or something like that. So they don't want to do it, which is fine. That can be your policy priority. But don't you think these things are a little in tension? The tension between, okay, we have so many, we gotta, send in the police to collect up all these guns, and that's in tension. I think it is. So I'm curious what you think with the progressive drive to not police so aggressively.
Well, I think some of the programs that folks on the left have pointed to include the gun buyback program in Australia, which of course wasn't sending police in to bang on the doors of citizens to collect guns, but to offer pretty significant financial incentives for people to turn in their guns. And they implemented that policy after there had been a really dramatic shooting in Australia, and the community came together and said, enough is enough. We don't want to live in a country where these kinds of things happen anymore. And voluntarily, people gave up their guns in exchange for cash. And before we, I think, dismiss the possibility of whether that would work in the United States, I think it would be interesting to try something like that. Certainly, doing nothing has created a lot of people to be incredibly frustrated. To that point, over the weekend, President Biden actually visited many of the families of the Uvalde, Texas massacre as a huge funeral service for the 19 children and 2 adults were underway. The president commented on his time in Texas and promised to push on gun control. Let's watch.
They spent 3 hours and 40 minutes with me. They waited all that time, and some came 2 hours early. And the pain is palpable, and I think a lot of it's unnecessary. So I'm going to continue to push, and we'll see how this works.
So many liberals, Robby, heard him say that he wants to push. He also was very clear that he thinks, he's going to kind of step back from making a lot of big public pronouncements because he feels as though if Democrats push certain specific gun control legislation, it will upset negotiations that are happening in Congress. And some folks are frustrated that liberals, the left, Democrats aren't taking this moment of real kind of national consensus that things were handled so poorly in Uvalde to push harder on specific forms of gun legislation. What do you think of that kind of strategic decision?
Well, I mean, I hate to give Biden any credit, but that kind of strategic calculation might just be correct. There tends to be, in the wake of a mass shooting, that there is somewhat greater support for doing something. Although everybody says doing something, and then the specifics of what that is, nobody can seem to really agree on or necessarily point to how doing this thing would have helped, in this specific scenario pertaining to whatever the incident is, and then nothing ends up getting done because the American people just don't have the same appetite for this kind of thing that liberal lawmakers do, or they don't see the connection, I guess, between what the gun control policies are and mass shootings. And frankly, I don't all the time either, because most, as I've said on the show, mostly the overwhelming majority of gun homicide, of gun deaths anyway, are suicides by handgun, and then a lot of homicides by handgun. And there's just so many, and these are people often who are not, under current law, should not have access to a firearm, but do because there are so many guns. So I mean, look, I know Australia did a buyback. Maybe we should probably. I'd like to look into that policy a little bit more closely, and then maybe we can talk about it with greater information later in the show. I know that's touted as something that Australia did that worked. I don't know if it would work here. It might actually. I could see it causing certain people to sort of mass buy firearms, because in the kind of they're taking your guns away, even if that's not actually what they were doing. I guess that would be the first thing I would worry about.
Yeah, well, to your earlier point about what interventions actually would stop incidents like these, I think there's a real danger in conflating mass shooting events with other kinds of gun violence, all of which need to be addressed. But the public interest right now is about how to prevent the specific kind of mass shooting, because it is so particularly gruesome. It has caused all of these children to be murdered, et cetera. Obviously, the lives of these two teachers as well. And so when you look at the most recent mass shooter events, as I believe you did on one of your radars last week, and I think we'll be talking about later today, it is true that a great number of them have happened with 18-year-olds legally purchasing guns at the time that they were 18, or having their young friends who were 20, 21 buying their guns for them. And so raising the age of gun ownership is something, whether it's to 21 or 25, that whether or not you think you support that ideologically certainly does seem to be something that would prevent mass shootings, especially these mass shootings in schools, where it does tend to be younger people who are still carrying around a lot of anxiety and frustration about their school time experience, something that I don't expect a 35-year-old to necessarily feel. But yeah, go ahead, Robby.
Yeah, well, look, I'm again not unwilling to discuss any specific policy, and the fact that he goes in day after his birthday or whenever it was, turns 18 and buys this weapon. But like you said, that there have been cases where an older where the guns are in the household because an older relative has them, or someone who purchased them legally, and they end up illegally borrowing them or getting them somehow. And it doesn't seem really obvious to me that would necessarily, raising the age, or does he then just do it when he turns 21 instead of 18, or does he, procure a weapon some other way? I mean, the sheer amount of time, and I am going to talk about this in my radar more today, the sheer amount of time he was alone with the kids in that room actually starts to make the quality of the weapon a lot less relevant in this specific case. That not necessarily the case in other mass shootings, where I think the quality of the weapon absolutely made a huge difference. But I'm no longer quite. It's very grisly, horrible to contemplate, obviously. But they were alone in that room with him for an hour. There would have been a lot catastrophic damage. With probably with a handgun that you could have. Because there's a trillion of them in this country, which I get. I wish we could wave a magic wand and make all the guns disappear in America. There would be less gun deaths, certainly, but we can't do that.
Well, Australia did, and we should continue that conversation for sure. The president's trip comes as the DOJ has launched an investigation into the school shooting, where officers, as Robby just said, waited over an hour outside the classroom where 21 people were shot dead. A DOJ spokesperson said the review was to provide an independent account of law enforcement actions and responses that day, and to identify lessons learned to help first responders to prepare for active shooter events.
There needs to be an investigation, so it's good they're doing that. The police, the head of Uvalde police, who was on scene and making these disastrously bad calls, he has now been named. I think he's under police protection because, frankly, there are probably people who want to drag him through the streets at this point. Yes, the investigation absolutely needs to take place. And look, I get that we need to wait for all the facts But I saw, a couple Republican figures almost going too far in that direction. Like, well, it's a difficult job. You don't want to second guess these people. No, we can second guess them. We absolutely are allowed to second guess them. I'm second guessing them right now. It was very, very catastrophically bad what they did.
It was almost felt as though we were giving some grace when this incident was unfolding. It seemed like there were some indications that things had been handled well, but I remember that first day covering it. It was nothing like what eventually came out. And what feels frustrating is to have extended a little bit of grace in that circumstance and to find out that there was all of this intentional misrepresentation about what went on the ground, that makes people now, I think, who are covering the story much less likely to want to give the benefit of the doubt to the police officers and other kinds of first responders that were on the ground that day. I'm glad they're doing an investigation. I don't know that they had any choice but to do an investigation. I hope that this isn't one of those scenarios where they do an investigation to find some fall guys, and the rest of the institution that had all of these institutional failures keeps on keeping on. But we will be updating you with the progress of that, I'm sure, in the coming weeks. But first, we will have our Raiders coming up next, and I hope you're looking forward to that.